Today it's hard to imagine that the first time I went abroad was when I was already over 30. Our school had an exchange with a school in Rome, so our entire group, who had never been anywhere, immediately ended up in Italy. What delight and goodwill we were surrounded by in Rome in the spring of 1990, how welcome everyone was to us, how everyone loved us. "Gorbachev is my friend," exclaimed the seller of ice cream and lowered the price. "Here's a Russian lady," said one of the Italian teachers, leading me into a shop near her house and clearly boasting about such an incredible acquaintance. And Rome fell upon us with its streets and squares, the Forum and the Colosseum, and the Vatican museums. We were taken on a tour of the Vatican, and suddenly we saw the Apollo Belvedere and the frescoes of Raphael. By the way, I absolutely do not remember such crowds that usually go there. Maybe it was the time of year, or maybe I just didn't notice them. Two high school students, tired of such a high concentration of culture, sat down on some table that stood in the corner, and it turned out to be antique. The teachers didn't behave much better. Arriving at the Sistine Chapel, we immediately, to the delight of the students, did what, judging by the notices hanging, was strictly prohibited. We lay down on the floor and began to look at the ceiling while lying down. We, of course, were quickly called to order, but still, after all the past decades, I still have the memory of the incredible happiness of lying on the floor and looking at the figures of Michelangelo looming over you. Many years have passed since then. I have visited various countries and seen the most incredible museums, by the way, many of them together with my students. Flying around Europe is not easy these days, but aviasales will always help you find the easiest way to get to the Vatican or some other great museum. And thank you, aviasales, for this, as well as for supporting history lessons with Tamara Eidelman. The Vatican, as we know, has a lot of secrets. They talk about it, write about it, make films. But of course, we will start from the very beginning and move gradually. So this is the first lecture in a whole cycle. And we will start, of course, from the time when there was still no state of the Vatican at all. There was no current luxurious St. Peter's Cathedral. When everything was just beginning. And it all began, of course, with the rise of Christianity. As we understand, Christianity comes to Europe from the East, from Judea. And in the 1st century, two existences of this religion, when Christians were still persecuted, then all the main Christian centers were actually located in the East. In the same Judea and Asia Minor, there were more Christian communities there. New teachings gradually penetrated the West, and we know that in Rome there were communities, mostly composed of either slaves or women from different walks of life. But the communities were small at first. But then Christianity gradually spreads. Despite all the persecutions, it grows. There are more and more communities. But what is important for our conversation today is that these communities are practically autonomous. They have their own deacons, presbyters, they can be called differently, but there is no single network that would connect them. There is no common head. They are in contact with each other, they can correspond, they can send someone to each other, but the unified church has not yet emerged as such a solid institution. At the same time, Rome, of course, was something frightening for the first Christians. Rome is the place from where pagan Caesars give orders to execute and persecute Christians. This is the place where pagan rites are performed, where bloody gladiatorial games take place. That is, this is all that the first Christians oppose. And Rome is always perceived as a city of debauchery, a city of sin, like a Babylonian harlot, in general, something terrible. But at the same time, be that as it may, the role of Rome in the entire world history was so huge that it still attracted, that it still seemed an incredibly important place. At first, in the first centuries, of course, the Christian communities that were in Rome were no different from others. Nobody said that the one who heads the Roman community is the most important priest. No, it didn't. But he was still attractive. And Christian tradition says that both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul came to Rome and, most likely, even martyred there. And for us, of course, the Apostle Peter is especially important, because the popes of Rome considered and still consider themselves Peter's vicars on earth. Well, it is believed that the Apostle Peter came to Rome during the time of Nero, during the terrible persecution of Christians, and at some point he decided to leave this terrible city, this den of sin, this place where Christians are persecuted, and he has already left from Rome, and then he met Christ, despite the fact that things are already happening, of course. After the crucifixion, the resurrection of Christ, and Peter asked him, "Where are you going, Lord? Quo vadis?" And he said, "I'm going to be crucified." And Peter was ashamed. He saw in this a sign of his own weakness. He returned to Rome and was martyred there. Again, the legend says that he was also crucified, and he specifically asked that you crucify him upside down, because he did not even want to think in death that he could be equal to Christ and be crucified the same way as Christ. Well, and, accordingly, Peter was crucified and buried somewhere in Rome, and it is believed that on this place, on the site of his grave, the Cathedral of St. Peter was erected, naturally, not the one that we see now. But then comes the 4th century. Emperor Constantine the Great allows the free practice of the Christian religion. He himself was baptized very late, on his deathbed, but for quite a few years he patronized Christians. And when he arrived from the east to Rome, and we know that Constantine completed this long process that took place in the Roman Empire, when all the main centers of the life of the empire shifted to the east, and Constantine created a new capital for himself, Constantinople, calling it New Rome. And he practically did not appear in Rome, in the first Rome. For him, it was an unpleasant city, as for many, by the way, emperors, with too large traditions of liberties, with a bad climate, in general, he did not need it. But still, Constantine visits Rome and, which is characteristic, that he, well, again, according to Christian sources, he does not participate in pagan rites, but takes part in Christian rites and orders on the hill where the Apostle Peter was buried, start building a cathedral, and here they start building a basilica, which will be the first St. Peter's. The story is beautiful, a story that many people believe. Moreover, in the 20th century, excavations were carried out under the current St. Peter's Cathedral and found that there really was a cemetery there in Roman times. Therefore, it is quite possible to assume that this story did not arise by chance. Of course, there are some questions. No grave specifically of St. Peter, of course, was found. And the problem is this. From the point of view of Christians, St. Peter, the Apostle, is the most important person. From the point of view of the Romans who executed him, he is nothing at all. He is not even a Roman citizen. The Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen, so he could expect to be executed in some way less shameful than crucifixion, and to at least be buried. And who is this fisherman from Galilee? Yes, no one cares. No matter how he was executed, most likely his body could have simply been thrown into the river or, well, it's unclear where. And it is absolutely doubtful that his grave was clearly defined. Of course, another option is possible. To this one can object that there was already a Christian community. Peter meant a lot to them. Maybe they remembered this place. In any case, Constantine begins to build a church here, and judging by the fact that this church was not in a very convenient place, on a hill, and it was not located exactly as it should have been according to Christian canons, it can be assumed that Constantine really knew some place. Well, in any case, he believed that Peter's grave was in this place. Maybe she really was there. On the other hand, maybe it was not a grave, but some kind of sign that perpetuated his memory. But, in any case, the church here on Vatican Hill was originally associated with the name of the Apostle Peter. IV century, Christianity gained freedom. It begins to spread very quickly throughout the Roman Empire. There are more and more Christians, and at the end of the IV century, the Emperor of Theodosius, on the contrary, prohibits all other cults. Christianity turns out to be the only permitted religion. There are already a lot of Christians, there are a lot of Christian communities. And at the head of individual parts of the empire, well, what will later be called dioceses or dioceses, are bishops. But there are many different ones, and the Bishop of Rome, he is one of them all. Of course, from the very beginning this taste of Rome still remains, but there is a second Rome, there is Constantinople. The emperor lives there. There is a luxurious palace there, huge amounts of money are invested there to build luxurious churches. And the Patriarch of Constantinople, the main clergyman in the East, actually, of course, considers himself the main one. He is here, next to the emperor. As one historian reasonably wrote, just describing the situation of the 4th-5th centuries, in the absence of the emperor, and emperors almost never appeared in Rome. The eastern ones lived in Constantinople, the western ones lived mainly in Ravenna or Milan. In the absence of the emperor, the pope was the most important man in Rome. But Rome itself was now a sad place, in desolation. Well, that is, there is honor, but there is no special power, at least not such real, tangible power. Constantinople is getting stronger, Rome is looked down upon from there. The 5th century is coming. The 5th century is significant because, well, as we usually say, there are already 2 Roman empires. Western and Eastern. Before that there was still one emperor in Constantinople, but now the emperor of Theodosius, dying, leaves the eastern part to his eldest son, the western part of the empire, to his youngest. He, of course, did not at all believe that the empire would thus fall apart into 2. Well, it's just that one son manages one, the other, the other. But from now on, there will be 2 emperors for about a century. But still, clearly the stronger ones will be in Constantinople. Moreover, the 5th century is a very complex, very difficult century. This is the time when everything collapses in the Roman Empire, when endless streams of barbarians come and attack Rome. And the Eastern emperors learned much better to negotiate with the barbarians. They had a sad experience when at the end of the 4th century even the emperor died in battle. Since then they have learned to bribe the barbarians, conduct diplomatic negotiations with them and, well, not to say to them, you go to Rome, but, in any case, to remove the threat from yourself. But the barbarians also knew that Rome was a great city, whether it was the Goths or the Huns, they all knew that Rome was somewhere, and they had to get there. And so, one after another, waves of invasion hit the Western Empire and will ultimately destroy it by the end of the 5th century. But during this time, the Roman bishops little by little, slowly began to, well, to use modern expressions, gain points. And here it becomes clear that, of course, Constantinople is the second Rome, the new Rome. It is a powerful, rich, huge city. And there sit powerful, rich, strong emperors. And the church seems to be doing well under the side of these emperors, but only if the church leaders obey these emperors. And in the West, all the weaker, less important emperors. And in 476, the barbarian Odoacer abolished the imperial power, sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, and the western part of the empire would disintegrate into barbarian kingdoms, Frankish, Burgundian, Ostgothic, Visigothic and so on. And in these kingdoms there are their rulers. It would be more correct, of course, to say leaders, but tradition already says that we should call them kings. They will all accept Christianity, sometimes first in a heretical form, sometimes immediately in the one recognized by the church, but, in any case, Europe is gradually becoming Christian, and in this Europe there is no powerful state force. First, the emperors in the 5th century squabble for power, different contenders, they fight off the barbarians, then all these barbarian kings fight among themselves. That is, state power, unlike the East, is reduced to a minimum. And there is no single binding principle other than the Church, and this will enable the Roman bishops to gradually, more and more, increase their role. It starts with little things. At the end of the 4th century, the Bishop of Rome, whose name was Cyrus, decreed that he should be called Pope. And from now on, the bishops of Rome will be popes. This also means little, well, Dad is like a father, but this is such a first step. Then Pope Innocent will be the first to decide that all decrees of church councils can come into force only after he approves them. It is clear that the Eastern church councils did not think at all about this decision of his and did not send him anything for approval. But everything that happened in the West was sent to him for approval. Moreover, in a situation where the emperors were very weak or did not exist at all, the popes immediately took upon themselves some function of state power. The same Innocent, in Rome is Emperor Honorius, weak, pathetic, completely uninteresting. He generally lives in Ravenna. And at this moment, in 410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, approached Rome. The emperor did not care at all. He was later informed that Rome had perished. And he said, "How? What a horror. I just saw him." Everyone was very surprised. It turned out he was referring to his fighting named Rome. And when they told him it was a city, well, he didn't care. But Rome didn't actually perish. Rome really was captured by Alaric. That is, they came in, they took away the wealth. Well, there was no horror, so that everything would be turned into ashes. That didn't happen. The following popes began to develop the cult of the holy martyrs. There are enough martyrs left by this time from past centuries. Here they begin to worship, they begin to pray. Then very often the church will be generally dissatisfied with this and will consider it a remnant of paganism, quite reasonably, all these venerations of the relics of saints. But for the Roman popes this was extremely beneficial, because here among their martyrs was the most important martyr, the Apostle Peter. From the middle of the 4th century, they began to constantly pull this thread from Peter to themselves and emphasize that they are Peter's heirs. The middle of the 5th century, Pope Leo I, he also performs such an interesting action. He gives himself the title of Pontifex Maximus, which is actually a pagan title. Pontifex Maximus is a high priest. It was a very definite position in ancient Rome. By the way, very often this role was played by emperors. Calling himself Pontifex Maximus, the Pope, as it were, also claims a certain power. Leo I is famous for another remarkable deed, at least as the legend says. When new barbarians, previously unknown Huns, entered Italy, everyone naturally fell into horror. The Romans were already accustomed to the Germanic tribes, they had lived side by side with them for several centuries, they could communicate with them. Already, many, say, Romans became related to the Germans. There were many mixed families, and there were already many Germans in the Roman service. And suddenly the Huns appear from the depths of Asia. Roman historians described them as simply fiends of hell. They said that they were born from the union of evil spirits with witches, and that they just didn't talk about them. Today, historians know that the Huns were not at all as savage as the Romans described them. But we don't care now. The main thing is that Attila, who is perceived as a terrible punishment from God, as a scourge of God, is already moving towards Rome. The Roman emperor rejects the demand to give him his sister as a wife, and now Attila goes to take both the bride and the lands by force. And Leo I comes out to meet him. But later Raphael will depict this in one of the rooms of the papal chambers in the Vatican. He comes out to meet him with the delegation. How many colors were used in different books to describe what this barbarian must have felt when he saw the procession of the Pope in ceremonial vestments, followed by his retinue. And it is not entirely clear how, but the Pope convinced Attila not to go to Rome, but to leave. What's happened? But it is natural to assume that, obviously, the Pope brought him a huge ransom, and Attila calmed down. But the legend says something completely different. The legend says that Dad simply influenced him with his conviction. And besides, Attila, during these negotiations, saw that behind the Pope there was a certain man in white, who was threatening him with a weapon. Well, it is clear that it was an archangel. And Attila was so frightened that he left. Well, I won't discuss the question of whether this story is realistic, but what is significant? What is actually true? Attila could well have treated with great respect the words of this, well, some priest, some, perhaps unknown, or maybe already a little known God to him, and understand that it is better with him do not contact. Naturally, the authority of the popes is still rising. And then it seemed that everything was a complete decline. The Western Empire collapsed, which means that all these wild barbarians, some are still pagans, some accepted Christianity, but, of course, still do not understand at all what it is. Various heresies, first of all, Arianism spread here. In general, somehow popes feel not very comfortable. And the main thing is that they, in general, find themselves, and this situation will last for several centuries, they find themselves dependent on the inhabitants of the city of Rome. And it must be said that for a long time the popes were elected by Roman citizens. That is, the clergy chose together, well, as they said, with the Roman people, but it is clear that not with all of Rome, but with the Roman nobility. That is, the popes are quite dependent on them. And the 6th century is such a difficult century for the Western Roman Empire, or rather, for its remnants. The empire no longer exists, for these fragments, ruled by various barbarian kings. But for the East, on the contrary, this is a period of splendor. This is the time of the reign of Emperor Justinian, the time of his great conquests, the time of the construction of Hagia Sophia. But I won't talk about this in detail. I have a lecture on Justinian on my channel. In any case, we must understand that the 6th century is the golden age of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, the enormous power of emperors, primarily under Justinian, who actually tried to bring all the lands of the former Roman Empire under his rule again. If the terrible plague epidemic had not begun, then perhaps he would have achieved his goal. And in this situation, the popes involuntarily find themselves in some kind of secondary position. This was manifested in many ways in the fact that they were little considered, in the fact that church councils held in the East consisted mainly of Eastern bishops, and few came from the West, and in general they looked at them with such contempt. And most clearly, the decline of the position of the Roman popes in the 6th century is seen in the example of Pope Vigilius, who fell into absolute dependence on Justinian. He even found himself sandwiched among several fires, because Rome was besieged by the next hordes of barbarians, and plus Byzantium, theological disputes were burning at that moment. We will not go into them now. These were complex disputes about the essence of Christ. It so happened that the Pope and Emperor Justinian occupied different positions. Justinian needed his support. And at that moment, when Rome was about to be captured by the barbarians, Vigilius was already in Constantinople, where they put pressure on him, demanding that he recognize the principles that Justinian orders everyone to recognize. And at the moment when the Pope was finally ready to accept these principles, well, whether he was ready or not, it is not entirely clear. He was thrown into prison, and there he remained for several years. That is, actually, the Eastern Empire showed him where the crayfish hibernate. And he later acknowledged these principles. By the way, these were completely meaningless theological disputes, which later, well, the Church recognized as an heresy, but which were recognized as true then, but which did not make much sense. The question was simply political. And in the 6th century, in the 532nd, Rome is already in the hands of the Ostrogoths. And it is obvious that at this moment the Pope is completely dependent on the Ostrogoths. This situation persisted until the very end of the 6th century, until 590, until the advent of Pope Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great was a Roman aristocrat, a brilliant diplomat and manager. It is thanks to him that Rome managed to recover, that the papacy managed to recover. Gregory the Great gave new life to the Church, turned it into a kind of centralized bureaucratic structure, gave the Pope the right to appoint and dismiss bishops. He was also a good manager, understood the needs of the population, ordered the distribution of bread, managed the construction of walls, in general, restored Rome. He was also a remarkable diplomat. His contacts, his communications are just amazing. He built relationships with the Lombards, who will be Rome's main adversary for several centuries. He built a relationship with the Byzantines, with the Eastern Roman Empire. And his letters, which have survived to this day, are a kind of encyclopedia of the life of the time. And the fact that he is called great is quite fair. And it is in honor of Gregory the Great that the Gregorian chant is named. But more about this later. In any case, Gregory the Great is a person who not only restores Rome, but also frees the papacy from dependence on the Ostrogoths, who makes the papacy completely independent from any political power, including the Eastern Empire. And it is during his pontificate that the Pope becomes the sole authority in Rome. It is interesting that in the year 600, in the 7th century, after a period of some decline, in the West, in the Roman Empire, a whole series of strong rulers comes. It was already said about Justinian, but after him there will be strong emperors. For several decades, these emperors will be able to hold back the onslaught of the Lombards. And now it is Rome, but not just Rome, but the Papal States, which are now forming, that have a chance to recover. But there's still an important point. The Pope is no longer elected by the people. Gregory the Great eliminated this system, because the Pope must be elected by bishops. But bishops are by no means just clerics, they are Roman nobles, and they are still busy with politics. And now, having become the Pope cannot not take into account the interests of the aristocracy. And, of course, as soon as the Pope tries to act independently, the aristocracy will be dissatisfied with this. And very often, from the moment of the appearance of the Papal States, the Pope will have to fight for power with the Roman aristocracy. In the 7th century, the popes also fought for independence from the Byzantine emperors. They also demanded that the Pope receive confirmation of his election from the Emperor. And, of course, the Pope could not agree to this. The 7th century is a very difficult time. The Lombards approach Rome again. There are a lot of different heresies. The influence of the Church falls. But in the 8th century, when Rome is already completely separate from Byzantium, a great period of the power of the popes begins. And it is with the 8th century that the modern papacy begins. But the greatness of Justinian did not last long. After his death, the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, gradually, more and more, weakened. Discords begin there. There are their own problems, and then the Arabs appear, who come out of the depths of the Arabian Peninsula. They begin to seize the possessions that belong to Byzantium, and in Byzantium, various emperors begin to take positions of iconoclasm and say that the image of saints and God and the Virgin Mary is idolatry, and crowds begin to break into churches and destroy icons. In general, Byzantium goes through several centuries of a very turbulent history and is gradually weakening. As the famous historian Henry Pyrrhon, a specialist in the Middle Ages, said, if there had been no Muhammad, then perhaps Charlemagne would not have appeared in the West, because the East was weakening, and the West had a chance to strengthen. But in the same way we can say that if Byzantium had not weakened, the Western Church would not have been able to strengthen again. Already at the end of the 6th century, that is, several decades after the death of Justinian, an energetic, strong Pope Gregory I appeared in the West, in Rome, who would later be called Gregory the Great, and he was not going to depend on anyone at all. He was the son of a Roman aristocrat. For some time he held the position of Roman prefect. Well, that is, he sort of ruled Rome as a secular person. Then he becomes a monk, he becomes a pope. Well, in general, he continues to act approximately as before, that is, he is engaged in the improvement of Rome, he is engaged in protecting it from barbarians, and now new barbarians have already appeared, quite seriously threatening Italy. These are the Lombards, the same ones who will give their name Lombardy in northern Italy. He protects his city from the plague. This is where the following story happened. When Gregory the Great was leading a religious procession through Rome with a prayer for salvation from the plague, then suddenly everyone saw that the Archangel Michael was standing on the huge mausoleum that Emperor Hadrian built for himself back in the 2nd century. Everyone understood that the epidemic would end. And since then this mausoleum was rebuilt, it became the Castle of the Holy Angel, in memory of this angel who stood on it, and an important part of the papal residence and in general the protection of the Vatican in future centuries. Gregory I was not going to submit to Byzantium. Even for some time before he became pope, the previous pope sent him as his envoy to Constantinople, and he really didn't like it there, and he didn't want to communicate in Greek and learn Greek. And by this time, there have been very important discrepancies for about a century. The service in the East is in Greek, and the service in the West is in Latin. This is another step in the divergence of the Eastern and Western churches. He wants to decide everything himself. Moreover, before him, the popes had a number of assistants, secretaries, people who took care of his household, and so on. This is what will later be called the papal office. Gregory the Great sharply strengthened and enlarged this office. That is, it's just that the bureaucratic apparatus on which he relied began to grow. Well, naturally, it was not yet as huge as the papal curia is today, but it was the beginning. He relies on his officials. He understood perfectly well that Christianity seemed to have spread in Europe, but in fact it was still adjacent to paganism, and he was very involved in the spread of Christianity. And, of course, the main thing he did, he sent a mission to the British Isles. It was very interesting with Britain, because when Britain was part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire became Christian, Britain also practiced Christianity. At the beginning of the 5th century, the Roman legions left Britain, and the local inhabitants were left to fend for themselves. And soon began the invasion of barbarian tribes from the continent, the Angles and Saxons. So Britain began to turn into England. The Angles and Saxons were still pagans. And it so happened that this Christian Roman Britain fell into decline. There was also a terrifying plague epidemic, so many simply died. It was captured by the Angles and Saxons. Christians remained there, but there were few of them, and the majority became pagans again. Well, there is a legend about how Gregory the Great walked in Rome and saw how slaves were sold, slaves were traded everywhere. And he saw wonderful, beautiful boys, fair-haired, handsome, and said, "Who are they?" "And these are the angels," they told him. "They look angelic," he said. But having learned that these angels were pagans, he, of course, decided to send a missionary to their lands. And he entrusted this to a monk named Augustine, who set out on his journey. On the way, he even decided that it was too difficult to deal with these wild Angles and Saxons. "Try to return," Gregory said. "No, go." And Augustine, who would later become Saint Augustine of Canterbury, he crossed the English Channel. He arrived at the court of the King of Kent. And at that moment there was no single king in England. He was accepted there. He began to preach. Soon, of course, everyone began to convert to Christianity, and he founded the cathedral in Canterbury. And gradually England became Christianized again. This was one of the achievements of Gregory the Great, not to mention the musical canons that he developed, the Gregorian, not to mention the numerous works that he wrote. Once again, the Western Church began to grow stronger. But the Church is strengthening, and Byzantium no longer listens, and ties with Byzantium are weakening, and Byzantium has fewer and fewer possessions in Italy, and then there are practically none left at all. And a lot of my problems. But in the north of Italy there are Lombards who are putting pressure on the popes, and not only them, and there is a danger that now the Romans, together with the Pope, will find themselves dependent. And then, naturally, the next Pope Zachary begins to look for some kind of counterweight. And he finds it. Because nearby there is a Frankish kingdom, in which the kings of the Merovingian dynasty are weak, mean nothing, boast only of their long hair, which they never cut, which supposedly gives them magical powers. But they always have strong, energetic mayordoms with them. Mayordom is the manager of the household. Well, what is the king's economy? All his kingdom. Here are the mayordoms and manage for them. The Merovingian kings had a powerful major, Charles Martel, who defeated the Arabs at the Battle of Poitiers. And at that moment, when Zachary began to look for help, then under the next such completely meaningless king, Pepin the Short was the major, who generally began to think about why I, in fact, should serve this incomprehensible long-haired man. There is a famous description, which is always repeated in all textbooks, how pitiful all these Merovingian kings looked, lazy kings, as they began to be called from the 19th century. The king rides in a cart drawn by shafts, like some kind of peasant, and next to him, on a white horse, a mayor rides, and everyone understands who has real power. And Pepin sent a request to the Pope, and who, in the opinion of the Pope, should be considered a king, the one who has real power or the one who only has a name? Well, it's clear what Dad answered, the one with real power. That is, he gave Pepin, as it were, such an indulgence. And soon the last Merovingian king was tonsured a monk, and once he was tonsured, his long hair was cut off. And the Merovingian dynasty ended, and Pepin, with the support of the Pope, became king and thanked the popes, because he gave them land. True, it is completely incomprehensible what were the rights of Pepin, why could he give them the lands around Ravenna? But that didn't really bother anyone. He gave them the Episcopate of Ravenna. Well, in fact, not only around Ravenna, but also around Rome there were lands, and this became the beginning of what would later be called the Papal States. That is, the popes of Rome became not just people who were at the head of the church, they also became rulers, and they had lands, they received income from these lands. This, by the way, complicated the situation, because in this way being the Pope of Rome was also profitable financially. From this moment, from the middle of the 8th century, some kind of close cooperation begins between the kings of the new dynasty, who will later be called Carolingians in honor of Charlemagne, which means Frankish kings and popes. This was already under Pepin, and Pepin's son Charles, that same Charlemagne, he will have long and such friendly relations with various popes. During his reign, several popes will be replaced, and Charles helped all of them. Karl helped them fight off the Lombards, although he himself was for some time married to the daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius, but this did not stop him from repelling Desiderius, preventing him from capturing Rome. He comes to Rome, the Pope meets him on the steps of St. Peter's. It was said that Charles was on his knees climbing these steps. And thus Charles supports the Pope, and the Pope illuminates the power of Charlemagne with his authority. Somewhere around this moment, it is obvious that in the time of Pepin the Short, father of Charles. There is a document that is solemnly placed in St. Peter's near the place where the Apostle Peter is believed to have been buried, and this document, which is the gift of Constantine, where it is written that Emperor Constantine arrived in Rome in the 4th century, while he was sick with leprosy, a terrible, terrible disease, which is no longer true. There was nothing like that. Of course, no pagan healers could cure him, and Pope Sylvester healed with his Christian prayers. And in gratitude for this, Constantine gave Sylvester the supreme power not only over the church, but over all possessions in Western Europe. Today there is no question, there is no doubt that this is a fake. This forgery was exposed by the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla back in the 15th century. But it's also interesting that somewhere around here at the end of the 8th, at the beginning of the 9th century, the popes of Rome, with the support of the Franks, began to assert that they have the highest authority, that everyone should obey them. As long as popes and secular rulers live peacefully, as long as they support each other. The next pope, Leo III, will be in a difficult position, because the nephew of the previous pope will also claim power. And he will attack when Leo III is walking solemnly with a procession through Rome. He will attack him, and he wanted to either blind Leo III, or cut out his tongue, well, in general, to make sure that he could no longer be pope. Obviously he wanted to become a dad himself. Similar things happened regularly in Rome. But Leo III fought back, and he received the help of Charles, who helped him stay on the throne. And then on Christmas Day 800, when Charles was praying in St. Peter's Cathedral, the Pope, well, as it is believed, quite unexpectedly for everyone, including Charles, crowned him with a crown and proclaimed him emperor. But it is believed that Karl was very surprised, shocked, did not want this, but then agreed. To be honest, I never believed this. It seems to me that all this was a conspiracy among them, but perhaps this is such modern cynicism in me. It was rather strange anyway, because for many centuries the emperor had only been in the East. And there in Byzantium they were not happy about this, but they were too weak and tied up in battles with the Arabs to still deal with this issue. And Charlemagne becomes emperor and creates a powerful empire, and the Pope supports him. But this wonderful situation does not last long. Charlemagne dies, his children divide his possessions among themselves, his grandchildren are already at enmity with each other. The empire of Charlemagne is disintegrating, then each separate part is still disintegrating, and soon the whole of Europe consists of such a mosaic, a set of small principalities and, perhaps, there are some slightly larger principalities. And in this situation, again, of course, the power of the Pope requires special authority. But what was happening in the 9th and early 10th centuries in Rome was a nightmare and quiet horror. It is difficult to retell all this, because popes change endlessly there. Someone is overthrown, someone is killed, the Romans rise. They decide who to choose. They rebel, they overthrow him, he flees. Then, say, one noble family proclaims one pope, another. So, some are dads, some are anti-popes. Such absolute chaos begins. And this papal power turns out to be a toy in the hands of secular clans, because papal power is also the possession of lands, and this is very profitable. Since the end of the 9th century, strange events have been unfolding, about which we know quite a lot. Because there was such a historian chronist, as they say, Liutprand, and he told us about these events in great detail. There is one problem. Liutprand really did not like those about whom he spoke, and he described them in the blackest colors. How true this is, we, unfortunately, cannot verify, because Liutprand's version is the only one, no others have come down to us. Accordingly, we are forced to believe her. Although we must remember that it may very well be that the colors here are incredibly condensed. Or maybe not. In any case, according to Liutprand, at the end of the 9th century, chaos was going on in Rome, terrifying depravity. And Liutprand associates the most terrible things with the activities of a certain woman named Marozia. And this is very interesting, because we generally know little about women at this time. And if we do know, it's only about some of these people who are not very similar to anyone else. Here Frost also clearly stood out. According to Liutprand, she stood out primarily for her wickedness and depravity. Even in his story, one can understand that, in fact, she was still very smart, strong-willed, striving for power. Here is what we know. What do we know? Her father was a Roman consul, that is, an aristocrat who ruled here in Rome. She had a husband, a noble military man named Alberic, and by him she had a son, who was also Alberic. But she was incredibly depraved, and, in particular, she had an affair with the Pope, and from this Pope she also had a son, whose name was John. And now it seems that Marozia loved this son of hers more from her lover than from her husband, because she prophesied a great future for him. She wanted to make him Pope. She, however, did not forget herself either and wanted power for herself. She had several husbands, many lovers, again, according to Liutprand, and in the end she marries a man whose name was Hugh of Arles, that is, obviously, he was from the south of France, but there was no united France yet and he claimed to be the King of Italy. All these titles at that moment were, in general, rather conditional. They marry and, of course, assume incredible power to receive. Gug does not immediately develop a relationship with the eldest son of his wife, with this same Alberic from her first husband, who seemed to serve his stepfather with water at a wedding feast, poured water on him by accident, and he hit him in the face, insulted. He, of course, remembered this, but for now he has to endure. Meanwhile, Frost is making every effort to make his second son the Pope. He is still just a boy. Therefore, she overthrows one Pope, installs another such puppet, then a third, and finally, when her son is old enough, he becomes Pope. Meanwhile, Alberic, the first son, decides to take matters into his own hands. He raises an uprising of the inhabitants of Rome. He conspires with various commanders of combat detachments. Guga flees, and Marozia is captured by her own son, who apparently puts her in prison, and then, alas, we do not know what happens to her, and this, of course, is a shame. But we don't know anything. How, what happened to her in this prison? They killed her or she lived there for a long time. I would like to understand how this bright woman ended her life. Don't clear. Then Alberic takes power into his own hands. He, apparently, was a reasonable ruler. True, he also overthrows this brother of his and, according to rumors, keeps him in his palace, turning him into his servant. There, obviously, there were some good relations in the family, interesting. He controls, of course, the election of popes. Popes change. Alberic has ruled firmly for several decades. Well, if you believe Liutprand, then very wisely, very well. And there comes a kind of calm. But the time has come for Alberic to die. He has a son, whom he named no more, no less, than Octavian, with the memory of the great Emperor Octavian Augustus, and dying. Alberic takes an oath from the people of Rome that they will make his son Pope and will obey him in everything. Which they do, and this boy becomes Pope John 12. Then again we can follow only the history that we know. And the situation is the following. So, John 12 is sitting in Rome, enjoying life. Let's say frankly that if you believe Liutprand, he was very happy, he drinks constantly, he is debauched, he has an incredible number of mistresses. Women pilgrims are afraid to come to Rome, because it encroaches on their honor. He elevates priests to the rank of cardinal in his stable, he allegedly drinks to the health of the devil, but, alas, it is not possible to verify this. Meanwhile, a new force is rising. In the German lands, the Saxon king Otto is strengthening, who in the middle of the 10th century defeats many enemies, subjugates large lands and accomplishes the most important work. This is a time of endless attacks from the east again. From the east came wild tribes of Hungarians. Imagine that today the Hungarians are such a civilized Central European nation. They were once terrible eastern nomads. Here Otto defeats them in the battle on the Lech River, after which the idea arises that he has the right to the title of emperor. But you cannot proclaim yourself emperor. At this point, following the pattern set by Charlemagne, it is clear that the emperor must be crowned by the Pope. Otto arrives in Rome, this terrible John 12 crowns him, they have good relations for some time, Otto leaves for his lands. Well, from that moment, in 972, the history of the empire began, which bore a very interesting name, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. These were German lands, but for some reason the empire still had to be called Roman. Otto goes further, he hears all kinds of terrifying rumors about what John is doing, what atrocities are also happening there in Rome. All this has been going on for a long time. It seems like he is trying to persuade him. In the end, Otto arrives with his troops. John flees. The bishops, their mouths opened, they began to testify to all the horrors that John did. They choose another pope. John wrote a letter to the bishops saying that if you recognize another pope, then none of you will have the right to be considered a bishop or appoint other priests. And in Russian it sounds normal, but in his Latin there turned out to be some kind of double negative, illiterately constructed, and the bishops answered him, "But we thought that a double negative means an affirmation," they say. "You should also write you cannot." But they hurried a little, because Otto could not sit in Rome forever. He had many problems with his subjects. And he goes to Germany, and John returns. And the inhabitants of the city of Rome, no matter how terrible it is, they accept it. This, by the way, may be a hint that Liutprand greatly denigrated this young man. In any case, the people of Rome accept him, he returns, he settles scores with everyone who testified against him, he executes their, cuts out tongues, chops off hands, God knows what he does, and again becomes pope. In the end, everything ended badly for him, because, according to some stories, he was carried away by the devil. Other, simpler versions claim that he was killed by the woman's husband, who found him in his own wife's bed and threw him out the window. In any case, John 12 dies. And then the series of various not very attractive dads begins again, arguing among themselves. But what's interesting is that all these strange stories about Marozia, about her mother, by the way, who also seemed to be a very depraved woman, about all these successive popes. It seems that it was from all these stories that one of the most famous legends about the early papacy, namely the story of Pope Joan. For some reason, different sources, well, indeed, later ones, of course, several centuries later, slightly differently, but they tell the story that supposedly somewhere right at this time, approximately there, maybe at the end 8, at the beginning of the 9th century there was a woman on the papal throne. The options are different. The main option is that she was an exceptionally educated English girl. It's also interesting that suddenly some woman in history pops up. She and her lover fled from home, she was with him in Constantinople, and somewhere else. She was incredibly educated, incredibly smart. So they arrived in Rome, and she traveled with him in men's clothing, posing as a man. And she lives in Rome for quite a long time. Everyone takes her for a learned monk. She amazes everyone with her learning, she teaches people, delights everyone. And in the end she makes a church career, and she is elected pope. But since she has another lover at this moment, she becomes pregnant. And then there was one version of the story that she had to sit on a horse, and then she began giving birth. And another, the most common, was the option that she also led a procession of believers in Rome, and right on the street she began giving birth, and then everything became clear. And then there are also different options, that she was stoned, that she went to a monastery, that her son later became a monk and became a bishop. This is a very common plot. It repeated itself over and over again. The closer to the era of the Reformation, the more evidence was required by the opponents of the Church. What vile popes, the more often this Pope Hus John was remembered. Jan Hus in the 15th century, when he was condemned for his teachings at the Council of Constance, he reminded those gathered at the council that this is how sinful the Church is, that there was a priest of John. In general, as one historian reasonably remarks that we have no information that at this council he was told, "You are lying, this never happened." They would take it all for granted, that it was reality. On one of the streets of Rome there was a statue depicting a woman with a child, and a legend arose very early that this statue stands at the place where John was born and, accordingly, where either she died or was killed by an angry people. And this is her memory. And then it's interesting how the simplest things are explained in hindsight. When the papal procession passed through Rome, it did not walk along this street, but walked along another. But that was just the route. But they immediately began to explain this by the fact that popes cannot walk along this street, because they recall with disgust the shame that this is how the papal throne was disgraced. That under the name of some John, it is not clear there. 8, 9, there was this one popess. Moreover, one of the moments of the coronation of the Pope, such a long, interesting symbolic process, when the Pope sits on a chair, and in this chair there are such recesses, where he sits, and immediately also an explanation. And the fact is that, allegedly, that after the priestess of Joanna, Each new pope, when he sat on this chair, was checked what gender he was. And that's why here in the chair there were such markings through which some priest could stick his hand and check. Most likely, this is also all a fairy tale, and there is no evidence from that time, the 9th century, that this story really existed. She is beautiful, she is romantic, films have been made about this. Pushkin was interested in this plot, he thought about writing the play Popessa John. I would very much like to know. And in fact, if they ever prove that it really was, what strength this woman should have had, what mind, what character. The 9th century, the 10th century, all these stories around Marozia, her offspring, John 12, somehow everything is completely. The papacy is in a pitiful state. Then, maybe there are no such terrible dads anymore, or maybe Liutprand just doesn't describe them like that anymore. But then the dad doesn't have much power either. But the year 1000 is approaching, and everyone is waiting for the year 1000, because they suspect that the world may end. Another thing is that few people, except for priests, knew exactly when this 1000 year would come. But somehow they are waiting for him. It is clear that he will be soon. Very interesting, the end of the world is approaching. Just in the West, an emperor appeared, an emperor with universal power. This is the kind of person who may well rule just before the end of the world. And even more interesting, if a person appears who has all the power, both secular and spiritual, everything will unite together. Otto I rules for quite a long time, then his son Otto II, who did not particularly distinguish himself, except that he was married to a Byzantine princess. And their son, Otto III, turned out to be the heir to both the Western Emperor and the Eastern one. And he realized this and understood his special role. And here the year 1000 is still approaching, and Otto III had strange thoughts in his head, that the Millennium Kingdom would now come and Christ would come. And maybe there would be some amazing things specifically associated with him, and we need to somehow build our relationship with the Church. There was a teacher whose name was Herbert of Avrilik. Perhaps many of my listeners remember that when Berliz and Ivanushka, Ivan Bzdomny, meet a certain stranger at the Patriarch's Ponds, they ask him, "Why did you come to Moscow?" To which Walland replies, "And I came because you have valuable manuscripts of Herbert Avrileksky in your library." This is exactly the person in question. And it is no coincidence that Bulgakov sent Satan to look for these manuscripts. Herbert Avrileksky was an outstanding scientist, he was an excellent mathematician, he was an astronomer, he knew many other sciences. Again, today it is already difficult to separate truth from legend. It was said about him that he traveled around Spain a lot. Well, in general, in the Middle Ages, everyone about whom they wanted to say that he had special knowledge was sent on a trip to Spain, because most of Spain was occupied by the Moors. And so Herbert Avrileksky studied somewhere with the Moors, acquired Oriental scholarship. In any case, it is believed that he learned from the Arabs about the concept of zero and introduced it into European mathematics, that he learned from the Arabs about the existence of the astrolabe, and told the Western world many other things. Otto makes him pope. And he becomes the pope and takes the name Sylvester, as the name of the pope to whom Constantine supposedly gave supreme power. And Otto together with Sylvester, it seems to them that they are such a couple that their joint power will now bring closer the second coming of Christ or some kind of complete transformation of the world. But this does not happen, as we understand. Otto III died young. As for Papa Sylvester, he also survived him for a short time. And they also told an interesting story about him, that he was supposedly predicted that the devil would take away his soul in Jerusalem. Well, naturally, it was assumed that he had long ago sold his soul to the devil, where else could he have such knowledge? And he decided that he would never go to Jerusalem, and he was not afraid of anything. And one day he was praying in a church in Rome and asked, "What is the name of this church?" That is, he came to church not knowing. And they said to him, "Holy Mary is in Jerusalem." And he realized that this was Jerusalem, and then, of course, he died. Naturally, all sorts of terrible things happened around his tomb, and the devil clearly wanted to steal his soul, and he asked to fill up this tomb before his death. In general, a lot of terrible things happened. But, apparently, the whole point, of course, is that he really was obviously an outstanding scientist, which caused fear. This is how the papacy entered the 11th century. We are approaching the great era of the flourishing of the Roman throne. By the second half of the 11th century, important changes were taking place in the Roman Church. This whole weakness, depravity, some incomprehensible position of the clergy, the lack of clear rules, all this is beginning to irritate many. The reform largely begins with the introduction of an extremely strict charter in the Abbey of Cluny, which was located in Burgundy. And this attracts many people. Cluny was a rich abbey, Cluny was an abbey with the strictest rules and, what is especially important, the abbot of Cluny reported directly to the Pope, that is, not to his bishop, not to the French king, but directly to the Pope. And further on, according to the Cluny rule, quite a lot of other monasteries arise. And the situation turns out to be that there are monasteries in the kingdom, and the monasteries own large lands, and the king cannot control them. In the 11th century, kings still put up with this, because royal power was generally weak, and the popes pursued their firm policies. And also several popes imposed strict rules. For example, before this, how was it not entirely clear whether a priest could actually get married or not? It was generally thought not, but this was often violated. Now rules are being introduced that under no circumstances, strict celibacy of the clergy is being introduced. Why is this needed? So that he would not have the desire to start his own farm, to work for his family, only for the church. Very severe punishments are introduced for the bad behavior of the clergy, and control is being strengthened everywhere precisely on the part of the Pope. This is done by different popes, but behind several of them is a very smart, educated, who, by the way, has risen from the very bottom, but thanks to his outstanding talent. The man who was the secretary of several popes was called Hildebrand, and in the end he himself becomes pope under the name of Gregory VII. This is the second half of the 11th century. He is full of energy, he wants to subjugate everything to himself. The kings are not yet his main rivals, but the imperial power still exists. And the German emperors do not want to depend on these rising popes. They are forced to depend on them, because only the Pope can make you emperor, and therefore you have to negotiate. But not a single emperor wants the Pope to intrude into his prerogatives, into his territory. This is exactly what Hildebrand will do. It begins with such a strange, as if trifling thing, who will appoint the German bishops. But it would seem that this is some kind of ridiculous question. A bishop is a clergyman, which means he should be appointed by the Pope. Everything is logical. But the bishop owns the lands and sends people to the army of the emperor, that is, on the one hand, he is, as it were, a clergyman, and on the other, he is a feudal lord, the same as any count or duke there. Then the emperor must appoint him. And this dispute literally breaks the relationship between Gregory VII and the German Emperor Henry IV. And it lasts a very long time, and there were many different turns, but the main thing happened when the already furious Gregory VII, and he didn't really like it when people objected to him. Like Henry IV, by the way, he excommunicated Henry from the church. Excommunication from the church is a terrible punishment. A person cannot pray in church, he cannot participate in any sacraments. This means that he cannot confess, cannot receive remission of sins. God forbid, he dies, his soul goes to hell. But for a king or an emperor, this is a special problem, because all his vassals give him a sacred oath of allegiance. If he's excommunicated, that oath means nothing. And Hildebrand freed the vassals of Henry IV from their oath, and they didn't really want to obey him anyway. That is, Henry has a problem. Either he will now agree with the Pope, or all his vassals will be against him. And then he goes through the Alpine passes in winter, which was very difficult, only with his wife and a small retinue. Despite the fact that in general there was a chance that some of his recalcitrant vassals would simply catch them on the way and kill them. He goes to the fortress of Canossa, which belonged to the ruler Margravine Matilda, who greatly patronized the Pope or the Pope. Perhaps the Pope was there at that moment. And he comes there and asks for forgiveness. He simply has no other choice. Gregory VII does not immediately grant forgiveness. For 3 days Henry had to stand in the castle courtyard, despite the fact that it was cold, barefoot, in the clothes of a penitent sinner, with a rope around his neck. On the 3rd day, the Pope allowed him into his presence, forgave him, they made peace, he lifted his excommunication, and Henry returned to Germany and was able to make peace with his vassals. And this was a great triumph of the Church. True, As soon as Henry restored order in Germany, he immediately sent troops to Rome to deal with this pope and take revenge on him. It was completely impossible for the pope himself to resist, and he had to ask for help from another secular force. The south of Italy at that moment was subject to the Normans. There was a Norman kingdom. These are the descendants of the Vikings, but of course they are no longer Vikings. They are Christians, although they are quite warlike. And Dad had no choice but to ask for help from them. And he had to flee to the Normans, and there he dies, so it's not entirely clear who won. Well, so, we played 1-1, I would say. And this confrontation between popes and emperors has been preserved. And in the following centuries, in the 12th and 13th centuries, it will intensify even more, because, on the one hand, the popes will incredibly gain wealth and authority, because at the end of the 11th century the Crusades begin. Pope Urban II preaches a crusade in 1095, but I won't talk about that in detail now. We had a lecture on the Crusades. But you need to understand the following. This crazy religious upsurge that took place during the era of the Crusades, it was very beneficial to the church, because there were huge donations to the church, because people, going on a crusade, left their lands to the church, and because there was a special tax later, when Sultan Saladin occupied Jerusalem. They would introduce Saladin's tithe, and everyone paid. All of Europe gave money for the Crusades. And if you could come to an agreement with your feudal lord, and, well, there is no money, where does the peasant get the money? And you can, perhaps, pay a quadrant and kinda work a corvée, come to his field there or, I don't know, to the forge there, to shoe his horses. But you can't come to an agreement with the church like that. They only need hard cash. Wherever you want, take it. They melted down church vessels to pay tithes. It's incredible what they did. How much of this money went to the crusade, and how much ended up in coffers in the Vatican, we do not know. But it is clear that the 12th-13th centuries are the time of the enormous enrichment of the papal throne. This is the time of the incredible growth of the authority of the Pope. It is very clearly visible, even purely outwardly, how everything is changing. The first popes wore such a simple white hat on their heads. It was believed that the same Sylvester, who allegedly received Constantine's gift from Constantine, walked in such a hat. And then gradually the cap is already turning into a crown, as a symbol of papal power, is already put on the cap. And just somewhere around the 13th century, this crown turns into a tiara, that is, such a triple crown topped with a cross. No one knows exactly why it is triple, and various explanations are given that this is a trinity. That this is the ecclesiastical authority of the Pope, spiritual, secular. But, in any case, the tiaras in which the popes will appear until the middle of the 20th century, only after that it will be considered too luxurious. Today the Pope does not wear tiaras. It looks like a crown. This is really a crown crowning a great ruler, developed over the centuries, and it is in these centuries that the luxurious ritual reaches its apogee, the attire of the Pope. His all these cloaks, mantles, each having its own symbolic meaning. The fisherman's ring is a golden ring that every pope received as a symbol of his power. Actually, a bishop should always have a ring. The Pope is a bishop of Rome. But he has a fisherman's ring. Why a fisherman? Because the Apostle Peter was a fisherman before Christ called him. And each pope received such a ring with which he sealed his documents, and when he died, this ring was broken, because the power of this pope was over. The next one got a new ring. And the popes were carried on a special stretcher on which the throne stood. This is not even a royal exit. This is the movement of some divine being that should not touch the earth. Some kind of priest, some kind of magician, maybe. Behind him were people with luxurious fans, also as if some ancient Eastern king was moving. But apart from all this luxury and all this symbolism, the popes in the 12th and 13th centuries simply claimed to have the highest authority. They could interfere in the secular affairs of any kingdom. This time knows many bright and strong collisions. It can be clearly seen that as soon as state power begins to increase in some kingdom, there rises a contradiction with the Pope. At the end of the 12th century, the great English King Henry II, father of Richard the Lionheart, appointed his protégé, his close associate Thomas Becket, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, that is, the head of the English Church, and was sure that since he had appointed his man, the Church would always be on his side. As soon as Becket became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he began to protect the interests of the Pope. He began to convey the demands of the Pope to the king. He ceased to obey secular authority. Heinrich was not the kind of person to endure all this. He was furious. Becket had to flee to the continent for several years. Then the Pope achieved his return. As soon as he returned, he began to show his defiance again. Well, then, as the legend says, Henry II exclaimed in a rage, "Who will save me from this? There, an absurd monk?" And then 4 knights left London and went to Canterbury. Becket somehow already knew they were coming. He prayed in the cathedral. They burst into the cathedral. To this day they show this place in Canterbury Cathedral, demanded that he immediately declare his submission to the king. When he refused, they killed him. Henry II was a great king. He clamped down on the feudal lords in England with an iron hand. As soon as he went against the church, naturally, the Pope excommunicated him. Naturally, everyone rebelled against him. He had to repent. He had to say that he didn't think anything like that. He simply said, "Who will deliver me?" And little did they understand, these knights. He promised to go on a crusade, but did not have time, because he died. That is, he was simply broken by this conflict with the church. Later his second son, his eldest son Richard the Lionheart, but we had a lecture on the Crusades, where all this was said, and the next king will be King John, John the Landless, also the son of Henry II, and he tried not to pay tax to the Pope. But it was necessary to pay him a special tithe, too, as a sign that he, as a king, obeys the Pope. The Pope also immediately excommunicated him. I had to obey. But the kings at this time are still not so strong. But imperial power still remains. And at the end of the 12th, at the beginning of the 13th century, there are several powerful emperors from the Hohenstaufen dynasty who do not want to obey the popes. One of them is Frederick Barbarossa, powerful, terrible, cruel, great. He wants all the Italian cities to obey him, and he wants the popes to obey him. But he agreed with the popes. The popes feared Italian cities, Italian feudal lords more than the emperor, and therefore one pope dutifully crowned Frederick Barbarossa, supported him in every possible way. And Barbarossa came to Italy again and again, and smashed these independent Italian cities, and defeated the city of Milan, and then went on a crusade. Well, obviously he had a stroke or something. He fell in armor into a small river, but when he was raised, he had already choked. Perhaps, because he died far from his homeland, the legend was transmitted for many centuries that he was sitting under a mountain, sleeping forever. His beard had already sprouted through the table at which he was sitting. Only from time to time he wakes up and asks his servant if the enemies are far away, and when necessary, he will wake up and come out from under the mountain. But his grandson Frederick too, he was made from a special dough. He was the son and grandson of emperors, and on his mother's side he was a descendant of the Norman kings who ruled in Sicily. And therefore, in general, he spent most of his time not at all in Germany, but spent in his Sicilian kingdom. And there was a completely unexpected situation, because there were many Muslims, many Jews. All these religious strife did not bother him. People of different religions existed at his court. He was interested in science. He himself wrote a treatise on falconry and much more. And even more, he was interested in power. Several popes changed during the time that Frederick II ruled. They all wanted him to act on their orders. First of all, that he went on a crusade. For some reason, he promised this once, and then it was already difficult to refuse. And he really didn't want to. He, as I understand it, he just liked to live in his home in Palermo. Plus, what is there to do? Once he even got on the ship, then he said, "Oh, I'm sick, sorry." But he was excommunicated from the church. He spat on it. He married the daughter of the King of Jerusalem, and at that moment the Crusaders had already created different states in the Holy Land. Jerusalem, however, was captured by Saladin, but the title remained. That is, his child will be the King of Jerusalem. As long as the child is small, he is the King of Jerusalem. He went to the Holy Land, and there he completed a generally unbelievable thing. He did not retake Jerusalem, what the Crusaders had been doing for so long, and he agreed with the Egyptian Sultan Al-Kamil that they conclude a truce. All pilgrims can freely come to Jerusalem and have access to all holy places. Everyone should be happy. The Pope was completely furious that he was negotiating with these infidels. The opposition of Frederick II lasted for a very long time, and now, as I say again, several popes in a row, they tried to convene a council against him in order to completely curse him. He, therefore, forbade the German bishops from going to this council. The French boarded the ship, because they could not do otherwise. They had to pass overland through his possession. Everyone boarded the ship, and he captured the ship. But the poor Pope was already old at that moment, and could not bear this blow, and died. This reign of Frederick was the peak of the empire's power. And here two forces of almost the same level collided, incredibly powerful, rich popes and this smart, talented, domineering Frederick II. But Frederick II was broken, because, firstly, the popes raised all his vassals against him, and secondly, he still could not be excommunicated all the time. He either made peace there, then was excommunicated again. And after his death, his descendants will simply exhaust them with this struggle, and soon the Hohenstaufen family will be interrupted. And the popes of the 13th century, there is a feeling that they have complete power. They no longer depend on anyone. This means that they have not been dependent on Roman citizens for a long time. These are all the nonsense that there are, you see, the Roman aristocracy will choose. This is all a thing of the past. Now only the conclave of cardinals is chosen. This means that no secular people, formally, at least, have nothing to do with this. Although, of course, all the rulers interfered in this as much as they could. A famous rule will be established, which, at least formally, must be observed today. When the next pope was elected in the city of Viterbo, and the pope was elected in the place where the previous one died, therefore not necessarily in Rome, and for a very long time the cardinals could not decide anything, there was a pro-French party, pro-Italian, different secular rulers also intervened. They could not come to an agreement among themselves. And then, according to legend, the citizens of Viterbo, who were tired of this disgrace, broke into the cathedral where the cardinals were sitting, and dismantled the roof, and said, "Now sit in the open air, and we will not feed you." And after that, the cardinals quickly decided everything. Although there is a version that at first they nevertheless agreed that the roof would be closed, and then we would choose. And the pope they chose introduced the rule that the conclave sits behind closed doors, no one has access there, so that they are not pressured. And if the pope is not chosen within a certain period, then less and less of them start to feed, they are given less food until they are left simply on bread and water, to thus stimulate the election of a pope. At least formally, it turned out that now the election of the pope is an exclusively ecclesiastical matter. Although, I say again, it is clear that this was not the case. But still, these past times, when different noble families simply put their man and that's it, it's already gone. The popes have long been independent of the Eastern Emperor. In 1054, a representative of the Western Church appeared in Constantinople, at the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, demanded that Patriarch Michael Cornelius immediately renounce the erroneous views, the heretical views of the Eastern Church that the Holy Spirit comes only from God the Father, and not from God the Father and God Son, and if he does not renounce, then, naturally, he will be anathematized. Naturally, the Patriarch for some reason did not yield. An anathema to the Patriarch was placed on the altar in Hagia Sophia. The Patriarch in response cursed the Pope, and they parted ways. But this discrepancy, as we know, at the beginning of the 13th century will lead to the fact that during the Fourth Crusade the Crusaders will sack Constantinople. They intervened in the political struggle between various pretenders to the throne in Constantinople, and when they were not paid for this struggle, they simply completely sacked the city. And they also explained this by the fact that they, of course, are Christians, but they are wrong Christians, which means that it is possible. And for half a century they established their dominance there. Roman popes also do not depend on the Eastern Church. Secular rulers. Well, the kings are only just getting stronger, the emperors are weakening. True, new forces arose that threatened the popes. And this was a great threat, because the 12th and especially the 13th centuries are the time of heresy. This is the time of numerous heretical movements, of which, of course, the strongest, most powerful movement of the Khazars in the south of France, but there were many others. In our country, all heretical movements are very often presented as popular peasant uprisings. Nothing of the kind. Heresies just originate in cities. Heresies are born among those who want to reason for themselves, who want to read the Bible themselves, and the Bible was only in Latin, which ordinary people did not know. Who want to interpret the Bible themselves, and these are rather townspeople, well, or priests. And the popes have to fight hard. And what was done during the reign of the great, mighty Pope Innocent III at the beginning of the 13th century, what was done to the south of France, is, of course, a nightmare and quiet horror. In the south of France, well, almost everyone professed this Cathar heresy. We do not understand very well what it was, because we only know its essence, only from the description of its enemies. No Cathar books have survived. But, apparently, these are ancient ideas about the dual nature of the world, that the world, ours, the material one, was created by the devil, and therefore we must get rid of it. The Cathars were believed to be recognized by their pale face, because they were fasting all the time, as if trying to minimize their contact with this world. But the Cathars were known for their wonderful, kind behavior, piety, in contrast to the corrupt and wealthy priests of the Catholic churches. And in the south they were supported by peasants, townspeople, noble lords, rulers. The story of the fight against this heresy lasted a very long time, but in the end Innocent III did an amazing thing. He called on true Christians to go on a crusade against their own Christians. And the chivalry of the north of France went south. The south of France was completely ruined. The ruler of Toulouse, who was the main patron of the Cathars, was forced to reconcile. The castles were partially destroyed, the flourishing south was destroyed, the heresy was defeated. But heresies will arise again and again. In parallel with this, other movements arise that are right on the verge of heresy. These are mendicant monks. The two main mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, would be created by Saint Francis and Saint Dominic just in the 13th century. And especially Saint Francis, the Dominicans, they are so more learned, more acceptable, and Saint Francis, who walked barefoot, in a cassock tied with a rope, who preached to the birds, who persuaded the evil wolf near the city of Gubbio that there is no need to eat sheep, and the wolf listened to him, this Saint Francis, whose life, in general, everyone has already told him very similar to the life of Christ. He prayed, an angel appeared and pierced his body in 5 places, just as there were 5 wounds of Christ, and so the stigmata appeared. He had 12 disciples, he fasted for 40 days, that is, they talked about him practically as about Christ. And it was also similar to the heretics who accused the church of corruption, of wealth, that they were almost recognized as heretics. But if you believe the legend, he came to Innocent III to ask permission to recognize the Franciscan order, and he said, "Who are you? Barefoot, dirty, go to the pigsty." And Francis went to the pigsty. And this humility of his made a very strong impression. And then the Pope had a dream about how the church in San Giovanni in Laterano, the main church where the Pope prays, was askew, and only Saint Francis supported it. Then, of course, he understood everything. And the Franciscan and Dominican orders would become the most important support of the popes and the basis, as expected, for the rebirth of the church. And at the same time, during the Crusades, knightly orders arose, the Order of the Templars, the Order of the Hospitallers, then many others, knightly and monastic. But I will not repeat what I said in the lecture about the Templars, but I will only say that they were also powerful, huge, rich orders and they obey directly to the Pope. That's what's important. The monasteries of the Cluniac Rite are subject to the Pope. The Templars and Hospitallers obey the Pope. Monastic orders are subordinate to the Pope. That is, the popes simply create an empire in different countries, which all serves them. And it was incredible power. And then everything began to change. By the end of the 13th century, royal power was already strong in many countries, and the popes were once again mired in their conflicts, disputes, and struggles for power. In addition, several new phenomena arose that, well, they probably noticed, I don't know if they realized. First, the Crusades failed. The First Crusade at the end of the 11th century was a huge religious upsurge, fanaticism, crowds marched, they captured Jerusalem, they won. And what happens then? Then the Crusaders lose Jerusalem, and then gradually Saladin ousts them from everywhere. By the end of the 12th century, they already had only a small piece around St. Jean Acre, this is today's Acre in Israel, Then they are forced out from there too. Naturally, the question arises, the first crusaders went, confident, our cause is just, God is leading us. And what happened? This is the failure of the Crusades, of course. The popes tried to resolve the issue. They said, go to other places, here to Spain to fight the Muslims, go to the north of Europe, there are still pagans near the Baltic Sea. But this was such a weak explanation. The main thing, the Holy Sepulchre, cannot be reconquered, and this has greatly shaken the authority of the Pope. Further, this incredible wealth and power acquired by the popes, they, of course, began to annoy. And the time is already, cities are growing, educated citizens are growing, their number is growing. They even try to translate the Bible, although this is forbidden to them. And they have questions. Christ said, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. How do popes live? Why do they interfere in political life? Why do they live in such luxury? Why do they sell church positions for money, although this is a sin? Why do they live in such depravity? The authority of the papacy is falling. Strengthening kings take advantage of this very skillfully. At the end of the 13th century, the Church was experiencing another crisis. Once again, they cannot elect a pope again, different factions are fighting, each for its own, they can't get the necessary 2/3 of the votes, nothing happens. And then one of the participants in the conclave exclaims, I proclaim Pope Pietro del Marrone. Pietro del Marrone was a very respected old hermit, and actually the conclave of cardinals votes, as we know. But there was a rule, it was called acclamation. Theoretically it still exists, only the last time it was applied was in the 17th century, when the Pope was elected not by voting, but simply by everyone jumping up and shouting, yes, this one will be the Pope, and this Holy Spirit is supposed to speak through the cardinals. And here, too, everyone jumped up and said, yes, Pietro del Marrone will be the Pope. He is completely confused, he does not want to leave his place. Political games also begin, because Charles of Anjou, who rules Sicily, this Pietro lives on his territory. He, of course, wants to send him in order to influence him, but he doesn't understand anything. They take him to Rome. First, general rejoicing, here is a truly holy Pope, an angelic Pope, in simple clothes. He rides into Rome on a donkey, and not at all in a luxurious carriage there, not on a horse. He becomes Pope. It immediately turns out that he doesn't know how to manage all this. Everyone wants something from him, and whatever they ask him, he allows everyone. They ask him for land, he gives land to this. There are different parties from him, they are tearing him apart. And he, poor thing, feels very bad. And in the end he calls the cardinals and says, I'm tired, I'm leaving. He says, I can't take it anymore. He changes back into his hermit's attire and leaves. And he, poor fellow, thought that they would just let him leave. It was clear to everyone that he would leave now, and he would become such a center of attraction for all the dissatisfied. And they catch him, he tries to hide, his students hide him there, but they find him and bring him back. Meanwhile, the new pope has already been made by the powerful, intelligent, proud man Benedictine, who becomes pope under the name Boniface VIII. Celestine V, and this was Rome, the papal name of this hermit. It is not entirely clear why he is being tried. They found him guilty of abandoning his great throne, and they imprisoned him in the castle, which he was generally very happy about, because this imprisonment was very reminiscent of his cell. And he lived for a short time in this imprisonment, then he died. They said that Boniface VIII killed him, just as they said that Celestine left for a reason, that allegedly Boniface, then Citani, built a special pipe in the Pope's chambers and spoke as if in the name of God, Celestine, go away, go away. A very dubious story, but that's how they told it. And the unfortunate Celestine V dies. This is a terribly unfair thing. He was a holy man, surrounded by universal veneration. Dante, who lives just at this time, and was very involved in all this political struggle, and suffered largely due to Boniface VIII, because his party in Florence, which belonged to Dante, were enemies of the Pope, and Dante was expelled from Florence. Therefore, Boniface VIII in the Divine Comedy is in the 8th circle of hell, where those who are punished for simony, for trading in positions, and he sticks out of the fiery grave with his head down, feet up. But Dante also placed poor Celestine in hell. He placed him at the entrance to hell, where those who, well, in Russian translation means insignificant, are located. When Dante and Virgil approach the gates of hell, they see some crowd there, screaming, suffering. Some gadfly wasps are biting them there, but they are not allowed into hell. He says, "Who is this?" And I, with my head cramped in horror, "Whose cry is this?" Hard-lighted to ask. "What crowd, defeated by suffering?" And the leader answered, "That is the sad lot of those miserable souls who live without knowing either the glory or the shame of mortal affairs. Having recognized others, I then recognized in the one who was from the great. I renounced my share in my cowardice. That is, these are people who have chosen neither good nor evil. And it seems that this very one who renounced in his cowardice, commentators believe that this means poor, unfortunate Celestine V, which, in my opinion, is terribly unfair. But it's not for me to judge, of course. And Boniface is confident that he will have a great reign. And he truly was an outstanding ruler. But another legend says that when Celestine was tried, he said to Boniface, "You are, of course, guilty of what is happening to me, and I can tell you that you have achieved papal power like a fox, you will rule like a lion, and die like a dog." But something also tells me that these words could have been put into Celestine's mouth retroactively, because that's exactly what happened. Boniface ate really, well, as a result of intrigues, got power. It's hard to say whether he arranged a trumpet in the chambers of the Pope, but he was clearly intriguing and wanted to be a Pope. And he was a domineering, strong, intelligent Pope. He made many interesting decisions. Then that is, he was completely the heir to all those great popes who came before him. At the same time, he got into several conflicts that simply arose because he wanted everyone to obey him. He had a sharp conflict with one of the most noble and wealthy families of Rome, the Colonna family, and he really didn't like them precisely because they were too strong. And they didn't like him because they wanted their own candidate for the throne of Rome. And at some point, when they were carrying gold bars for the papal treasury, one of the representatives of the Colonna family, mortals were simple at the time, he attacked this caravan and captured these bars. It was possible to demand that this particular person be punished, but Boniface decided that this was an opportunity to deal with all the columns. He excommunicated them all. He sent an army against them. And at first he achieved everything. He defeated them, he seized all their possessions, and they had many possessions in Italy. They took refuge in the last city that still belonged to them in Palestrina. The city was besieged, they had to surrender, and in the end they all had to leave Italy. And they went to France. France is ruled by a strong, cunning, intelligent king, Philip the Handsome, Philip IV. He was discussed in a lecture on the Templars. This is the king who destroyed the Knights Templar and was cursed by Master Jacques de Molay. And Philip the Fair did a lot to strengthen his power. But he was not the only one. Before him, the French kings throughout the 13th century gradually, stubbornly strengthened their power. They weakened the feudal lords, they tore down their castles, they limited their rights, they relied more and more on officials who were not very noble, and this is how they acted. Therefore, the Templars were ruined, because Philip needed money and because Philip did not need competitors, a powerful order in his possessions, and the Pope, although he is not in France, he is dangerous, he wants to dictate his power too much. And they disagreed with Philip on various issues. And in particular, Philip condemned a certain bishop for numerous crimes, and Boniface did not even begin to figure out whether this bishop was really guilty or not. He believed that the king could not judge the bishop, that was his papal business. He also immediately threatens with an interdict, promises of war immediately begin, and so on and so forth. And then Philip sent one of his close associates, Guillaume de Nogaret, to Italy. Guillaume de Nogaret's grandfather was burned at the stake on charges of the Catholic heresy, of course. This was not under Boniface, but, obviously, some sediment remained. And the attitude towards papal power was not very good. The second person who leads this detachment is Sciarra Colonna. This is one of the Colonna family, which Boniface hates. And they go to the Pope. At that moment he is in the city of Anagni. There is some panic in the city, of course, when this detachment bursts in there. Boniface behaves with dignity. Although it was predicted that he would die like a dog, he is sure that he will be killed now, and when they break into his palace, they see the Pope sitting on the throne, well, at least on the chair, in full vestments and looking at them. And if you believe the main version, then Guillaume de Nogaret approaches the Pope and slaps him in the face. After which he is captured, and for several days he is captured by the French, and then he is recaptured by the inhabitants of Anagni. Well, Nogaret understands that they have to fight here further, and they leave. But Boniface, firstly, is completely shocked by the insult inflicted on him, and secondly, it is believed that during the days that he was in captivity, he did not eat or drink anything, and was afraid that he would be poisoned. There is a version that he was in such despair that he gnawed his wrists, banged his head against the wall and thus simply killed himself in such a strange way. Well, most likely, of course, firstly, he was already an old man, plus this shock, plus, of course, the shock of being in captivity, and soon he dies. This was the strongest blow dealt to the Roman Church. And soon after this, the next pope, seemingly solely for his own good, so as not to depend on Roman citizens, so as not to depend on the quarrels occurring in Rome, on the struggle of clans, moves to Avignon. Avignon was not directly the possession of the French king at that moment, but it was very close. And therefore, during most of the 14th century, the popes would live in Avignon and be dependent on the French kings. A completely different era in the history of the papacy is beginning. More on that next time. I look forward to your comments. Happily.